So what I want to do today is talk about a particular app. Hearing and communication is the kind of label that I've been using for them, a particular app called Soundprint, which I think is really, really interesting. But I want to move out from analysing that app to thinking about questions that have arisen in kind of critical media studies, in health studies, and in disability and deaf studies as well, about a few different topics. So in particular, I'm really interested in the ways in which kind of capitalism has essentially sought to create value from diverse embodiment and the ways in which that's happening in the modern world. And I want to use this app as a sort of an indicator of some of that. And I think that's shifting in interesting ways. I also want to reflect a little bit on some of the kind of shibboleths of critical media studies about mobile media and what they might mean, particularly M-Health, so mobile health apps. So those are the sorts of big things that I want to explore through this one small app, and throw a bit of jargon at you as well. So if you want to read more about this paper is a sort of condensation of a chapter and an article I used to call my boomerang article because I sent it to 4 different journals. It got reviewed 5 different times, rejected twice at the desk editor level. So it's going to be coming out in television and new media, hallelujah, very soon. Thanks very much to the Mobiles group, especially Denis, who I think has read it 3 times. So this is the guts of what I've got to say, and there's some references if you're interested in checking out in more detail what I've got to say today. So this is the app that I'm interested in talking about, Soundprint. So essentially it's described in some of its publicity as Yelp for noise. So it's a crowdsourcing app. And what it does is it asks people who like to go out to social spaces that are quiet to crowdsource decibel readings, decibel meter readings of those different venues, so cafes, restaurants, bars. And the sort of aspiration of it is to find quiet places where it's easy to communicate. And the person who came up with the ideas, a person who describes himself as having hearing loss, so a hearing person, but you know, who struggles to hear in noisy places with noisy background. But the creator of the app doesn't really see it as a product specifically for hard of hearing, deaf people. He sees it as something that lots of people might benefit from. So that's, in some senses, I think this is an example of an app that, I don't know, we could call them ambiguous technologies. So there's quite a few of them now in the hearing and communication space, and I've put some images of some of them up on the screen. So Ear Machine might be one, Music Match that produces lyrics alongside music, Audio Fix, which kind of tweaks the sound on video, Google Live Transcribed, you know, widely used by a lot of deaf friends. So these technologies are not necessarily specifically pitched at people who identify as hard of hearing or deaf. They're addressed to a wider audience, but they can still be used for specific purposes by particular groups of people. So they hover on the edges of what Fiona Kumari-Campbell's called DIS technology, so specialist or assistive technologies. Now, there hasn't been a humongous amount written about this stuff, and I think it's partly because within its kind of disability studies context, there's an incredible weariness with discussions of technology. So as Alison Sheldon comments, every new technological breakthrough is inevitably hailed as a saviour for disabled people, as a way of minimising their deficits and thus making them less dependent on other people. So technology as silver bullet, there's a lot of scepticism about that in disability studies kind of circles. But nonetheless, there's some really interesting analysis out there, and I really love this bit of analysis from Tobin Siebers a few years ago, talking about like technologies like a power scooter that could be like a motorbike, or they could be a motorised wheelchair, and it's kind of unclear to the viewer which they are. And Siebers kind of says at first people, you know, non-disabled people are attracted to these technologies, they're like, oh, what are they? And then Siebers suggests afterwards, when they assume their indexical quality as a sign of disability, people who moments before approached its user with a sense of curiosity kind of back away in a sense of dread. Now, I don't think anything as dramatic as dread could be associated with these apps. I think they're seen as much more low-key than that. But nonetheless, I think there's a really interesting place for these ambiguous technologies, digital technologies. And what really interests me about them is that they kind of are in a kind of liminal space, they're on the edge in terms of the kinds of meanings they evoke. And so to think about the ways in which these apps might work, I'm really interested to use the work of Carol Backey, and thanks to Kate Manlick, one of my PhD students, who reminded me of Carol's later work, and particularly her work on within health policy, which raises the question of what is the problem represented to be? So Backey addresses health policy, and rather than seeing policy as kind of addressing pre-existing social problems that are already like out there in the world, instead Backey says health policy helps to constitute particular problems. So the problem of drugs, the problem of addiction, the problem of skill. So policy formulates those problems and then creates solutions or ways of addressing those problems. So I found Backey's ideas really, really productive for thinking about apps, and particularly about the ways that apps seek to kind of address a problem. So I've tried to adapt her WPR method in that kind of context. And that process has raised, to me, a very interesting question, but I think this is a sign that I am like a full nerd, and that is the politics of categorization or taxonomy. So I think this question of how do apps create a problem is also associated with the kind of meanings of the categories that apps belong to. So I've put up a picture here of some of the more popular categories of apps on the App Store. But I want to think about those categories as less kind of boring administrative stuff and more political stuff. And I really like this quote from Michelle White, who says, categories create a set of objects, articulate what's recognisable and purchasable, and structure how things should be viewed. So categories do this important kind of conceptual work. And I want, in the case of hearing and communication apps, to link it to the work of Matt Haygood, whose book Hush came out a couple of years ago, and he's writing about tinnitus solutions, technologies. But he kind of has this idea of biomediation. So he suggests that technologies like digital technologies, apps and so forth, function to produce bodily experiences, norms, practices, identities, and publics. So he's thinking about media technologies like screening technologies, diagnostic technologies, as well as social media type technologies that might help create communities or counter publics that might respond to mainstream media ideas. So I'm really interested in this politics of categorization. I haven't been able to find very much stuff on it, so please tell me if there's more that I've missed. I guess the other thing that I find really fascinating about these health and communication apps and the general domain of hearing, deafness, etc., is that we, again, like these ambiguous apps, you see the proximity of different ways of understanding lived experiences, sometimes which exist sometimes side by side, sometimes as kind of rival ideas. And I know there's people here who know more about this than me, so I'm happy to be corrected on any of my accounts here. But certainly there are at least 2 or 3 different ways of thinking about the embodied experience of different sorts of hearing. And that is particularly a biomedical or a biomedical/technological account, which sees strategies for differences in hearing to be dealt with through medical interventions, perhaps the uses of individual amplification technologies like hearing aids. And this kind of paradigm talks about hearing in terms of health, particularly hearing health. So that's a kind of key term. There are rival social and cultural paradigms, and there's multiples of these. But I guess those approaches to differences in communication mode or differences in hearing tend to focus more on rights and access. And rather than focusing on individual bodily changes, focus instead on collective strategies for access and communication. So particularly culturally deaf people who view themselves as a linguistic minority and need access to interpreters and other resources in order to participate fully. What I want to point out here is that the sign health doesn't tend to be used in this space. So words like disability and health don't seem to be relevant, and other kind of concepts like access might be seen as more relevant. Now, I'm aware there's some overlap between these 2 kind of types of paradigms, and particularly the psychosocial paradigms, which do acknowledge that being marginalised has itself got health consequences, is another kind of intermediary space, I guess. Okay, so side by side in this space of health apps, you have these very different ways of understanding experiences, and I find that really, really interesting. So I want also to think about the ways in which media studies has highlighted the problem formations around mobile media and mobile health apps in particular. So reading across a lot of critical media studies, a lot of what critical media studies has to say about health apps, and it's got critical comments to make, is about these kind of three ways of understanding the body. One is that critical media studies has tended to say, well, health apps tend to address this self-managing individual, the person who uses tools like digital tools in order to enhance their self-care. And that idea of self-management and responsibilization is really central to digital media, according to these approaches. A second thing that media studies has noted about mHealth is it tends to quantify. So it encourages us as users of these tools to kind of count the numbers of hours of sleep we have, the numbers of steps we take, you know, how many hours we spend on screens, too bloody many in my case. So we're asked to quantify our bodies and track our bodies through numbers. So Deborah Lupton, who's written a lot in this area, kind of says, self-tracking conforms to cultural expectations concerning the importance of awareness, reflection, and taking responsibility for managing and governing oneself and improving one's life chances. So this quantification of the body is really important. And Kudry and Measures have also pointed out the financial value of this quantification. So biometric data, they say, is the new oil. It's so valuable. So there's this sort of creation of value from bodies in this way. Critical media studies point to a third dimension to the ways that mobile health apps tend to work, and that is what is called healthism. So healthism points towards the ubiquity of health as a category in our modern world. So this idea that everything's health, food is health, walking is health, looking at TV is health, everything is health. But also the idea of health is a kind of secular moral goal, that we're expected to sort of aim for health and be constantly managing our bodies towards endlessly improving health. So that's a kind of built-in element of a lot of digital health tools, according to critical media studies. So obviously I'm only setting this up in order to knock these straw men down. That's my plan, and I've revealed it to you now. But before I do that, I want to show you a couple of examples of what I think are super interesting analyses of mHealth tools using these that come out of this tradition. So I really love the work of Dylan Mulvin, who's done work on the night shift. So this is where people making phones have kind of gone, gee, blue light's bad for people and it's stopping them getting enough sleep. So we should have different modes on our phones to help people sleep. So Mulvin does a brilliant analysis of this and says, look, you know, in a way it's a sort of prophylaxis by the media trying to manage the damage that it itself creates. But Mulvin also points out that this is kind of media trying to solve social and economic problems. Like, we're not getting enough sleep because work's intensifying. We're not getting enough sleep because, you know, commutes are longer, you know, precarious work proliferates, we're expected to do shift work, all of these kinds of things. And simply having like a darker screen when we're lying in bed at night is just not going to solve that problem. So you can see Mulvin's analysis is digital tools individualize social and economic problems, right? And the same kind of analysis happens in Alison Kenner's excellent paper on asthma apps, where she took, this was a few years back now, she talked to developers of asthma apps and she said, look, even though the developers knew that GIS, you know, global information systems info, weather info about air pollution was going to be super useful for asthma sufferers, they still didn't build it into their apps because it was seen as kind of like not going to be very amenable to being addressed. Instead, the developers focused on compliance with medication and kind of self-management of use of medication and self-management of those kinds of things. Okay, so this work is really interesting. It does good stuff. But I don't think it fully describes Soundprint, my case study. And I want to suggest some ways in which Soundprint is trying to do some different things. And I think there's different kind of dimensions to the use of mHealth going on in Soundprint. So I want to unpack some of those. I think what's really interesting to me about Soundprint is, unlike most of the other hearing and communication apps, it's not really primarily about individual self-management. That's not what it's doing. It's not about rectification of difficulties in, you know, hearing something. It's not about that. It's not about individuals managing stuff. It's about documenting the wider social world. And I think that's what's really interesting. It moves beyond the individual as a problem. So very much beyond that kind of neoliberal frame in some respects. Another thing that it does, which is a bit unusual, is a lot of disability studies has pointed out the ways in which, we have this proliferation of toxic environments where we're working too hard, there's too much inequality, it produces damaging effects on our bodies. But we're encouraged to do self-care and to look after ourselves, but so rarely is the problem of the toxic environment flagged up. But actually, Soundprint does do that. So even though it's using a kind of medicalized and deficit framing to foreground the dangers of loud noises for hearing people, nonetheless, it does point to the kind of toxic environments in which that damage happens. So it is pointing towards the social conditions of health in interesting ways. Another sort of strand of what Soundprint is doing, which I think is really interesting, is it picks up on what I think is an increasingly common logic in these kinds of digital tools. And then it shifts from the language of disability or the language of health to the language of uniqueness and diversity. So you can see that very much in the logo. So they use this sort of ear fingerprint combo logo. That's all over the place now. So Cochlear has an app, a plugin that uses the phrase hearprint. So again, evoking the connection between a unique fingerprint and unique type of hearing. Mimi Hearing Technologies, the subject of my epic boomerang paper, also uses exactly the same metaphor. So diversity has kind of come to the fore as a sort of an alternative to the language of disability in these apps. And in some senses, I think that's acknowledging and trying to avoid the stigmatization of disability. But in other ways, I think it's doing different things. It speaks to this focus on individualization in our contemporary kind of neoliberal culture. However, as we know, I know you know, Gillian, particularly critical race studies and whiteness studies has pointed out the problems with this language of diversity. So I really love this quote: diversity offers a gently unifying, cost-free form of political commitment, compatible with the mediated consumer logics of contemporary society. So it's, it's a friendly way of dealing with inequality. And there's been some really great coruscating critiques of this language of diversity emerging in deaf and disability communities from Michelle Friedner and Karen Weingarten. So saying that, well, focusing on diversity really understates the dramatic inequalities of experience between different groups of people and presents difference as sort of easily overcome, as not something that's difficult to challenge. So that's, I think, a really interesting, compelling critique of Soundprint. But I still think that Soundprint is doing something quite interesting in this focus on the social. So I want to kind of head towards the finishing line by talking a little bit about auditory ecologies. So what I find really fascinating is the connections between spaces and communication. I don't think have been discussed very much amongst hearing people and, in the wider cultural studies environment. And I'm willing to be wrong here, so please tell me if I'm wrong. But that's a group of people that have considered this quite significantly is deaf people. So Gallaudet University in the US has produced this, the architects who build their buildings over there have produced this concept of deaf space, where they've said, look, you can create buildings that maximize deaf gain, the advantage of being able to see over a long distance and communicate over a long distance, sensory reach, they call it, but also that consider things like the need to maintain eye contact when you're signing, the need for wider corridors, the need to be able to see through doors so you know someone's coming, all of these kinds of things, not having ramps rather than stairs. So the idea of communication and spaces being intimately connected is present in that idea of deaf space, which I think is really interesting. And what I'd like to think about more is how that might be relevant to hearing and hard of hearing people's experiences of spaces as well. So the idea of auditory ecologies, which has kind of come up a little bit in audiological writing, but not very much, seems to me to evoke that notion. So Soundprint is really thinking about auditory ecologies. It's thinking about how communication can be enhanced and enabled in particular spaces. And that's what I think is really interesting and progressive about it. And Soundprint is also seeing social life as a resource. So the crowdsourcing of sound and the idea of social interaction as a positive are all about, a very positive view of social life. And this emerges in other kind of more medicalised accounts of deaf and hard of hearing people's experiences. So I've got on the screen here still from a kind of filmic hearing test produced by Cochlear. And the message of this film, I do use it in my teaching because it really blows me away, is that like if you can't hear properly, then you probably won't have lasting relationships. Okay, well, I find that quite a distressing concept, to be honest, as a person with significant hearing loss. But this sort of sees social life as potentially threatened if you have non-normative embodiment. So social life is desirable, but also potentially a threat. But Soundprint reframes the social world as a resource, which I think is a really interesting idea. So I kind of want to wrap up by thinking about the way Soundprint, we might imagine what Soundprint's doing in using the decibel meter readings along the lines of what Pritchard and Gabrisse have described as citizen sensors. So Pritchard and Gabrisse are talking about fracking and the way people were asked to do environmental measurements of air quality in their cities. And this was seen as a kind of a way of avoiding the agonistic kind of fighting over fracking and a kind of more science-based and calming way of dealing with the problem. So this idea of people measuring their environment and collecting that information together as a kind of mitigating of inequalities and mitigating of social problems, but through a kind of medium of science is part of what Pritchard and Gabrisse are kind of mapping. And I think in some senses what Soundprint's trying to do is a little bit like that. Certainly they're no radicals. The people have come up with this app. They see this happy future where venue runners and hearing people and hard of hearing people can all work together to enhance our social lives. So yeah, it's not a utopian moment, but it's an interesting one to think about. And I really love this quote from Alan Ralston, who talks about the idea of rather than seeing technology as this tool for ameliorating individual deficits or transforming individual bodies, that maybe technologies could be used to rehabilitate environments, to, you know, transform environments so that they're more enabling for a range of people. And the environment that pops into my mind, I wrote about in one of my papers, is the hellish auditory landscape of the Hearing Hub Cafe Piccolo Me, in which I just said I frankly cannot function fully in English, although it's quite a good place to go practice my sign language, but it's a really terrible place to listen to people. And which seems such an irony in a building that was built intentionally for hard of hearing, deaf people, lots of people coming who are not, you know, don't have standard hearing. So I think, you know, we do need a little bit of amelioration and rehabilitation of some environments, and maybe Soundprint's one way of doing that. Anyway, I'll finish there, but thanks so much for listening. And I'll stop sharing as well.
Thanks very much, Nicole.
I'm really sorry, Kerry. I did rattle away there. I didn't mean to be quite so quick.
Thanks very much. And so we're going to move straight through to these three papers in a row and take questions. And so next, great pleasure to invite Dr. Jessica Kirkness, who's going to speak about a paper titled Listening, Music, Deafness and the Hearing Line.
Awesome. Just checking that my sound is coming through okay. Everyone can hear? Amazing. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen and hope that it works. Okay. Right, brilliant. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. By way of introduction, I wanted to give a little bit of context to the origins of my interest in deafness and music. So I actually grew up with two deaf grandparents. My grandmother went deaf when she was a baby, and my grandfather went deaf when he was 8 years old after contracting meningitis. And like many other deaf people, my grandparents didn't perceive their deafness as a disability. Rather, they considered themselves part of a cultural and linguistic minority group, united by a shared set of language, customs, language, and a way of seeing and being in the world. So despite the fact that my grandparents couldn't hear anything at all, they were very interested in music. My grandfather always loved musical theatre and watching military marching bands, and he would religiously watch the Edinburgh Military Tattoo every year and Last Night at the Proms. And my grandmother really enjoyed choral performances, and she took a keen interest in my interest in singing and piano as I was growing up, and would often approach the piano and place her hands on the keys as I was playing. And it was these sort of tactile, visual, and kinesthetic modes of engagement that inspired me to investigate the rich and diverse ways that music is perceived and used within the broader deaf community. So I guess that's just acknowledging a bit of my positionality and history there. So music might seem at first a very odd area of focus when it comes to the deaf community. And in the minds of most, music and deafness are strange, incongruous partners, and the term deaf musician is a curious oxymoron. But as Papathanzu et al. Suggest, the involvement of the deaf with sound and music is not strange or insignificant. There are several deaf and hard of hearing musicians who work and teach in music-related fields, most notably the Scottish percussionist Evelyn Glennie. And the existence of professional deaf musicians, along with charitable organisations like Music and the Deaf, provide evidence of deaf people's interest and participation in musical pursuits. And I'll be talking a bit about Music and the Deaf specifically a bit later on. Nevertheless, the relationship between deafness and music is contested, perhaps even taboo. A common sense understanding of music situates it as something that must be heard. That is, it relies on audition in order to be enjoyed and ascribed meaning. Music is thus generally considered to be a practice and phenomenon that belongs to hearing people, and perhaps to the audist and phonocentric cultural order of the hearing world. Say audist, I'm referring to the practices of audism, a term that's very much like racism or sexism, and it's used in deaf studies scholarship to refer to the notion that one is superior based on one's ability to hear or behave in the manner of those who hear. And something else that needs to be reckoned with when discussing deaf culture and history is oralism, a medico-pedagogy which forbids the use of sign language and enforces the use of speaking, reading lips, and auditory training. So oralism was actually enforced for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, and deaf students were forbidden to use sign language in their schooling context. And this was sort of a, deaf people were physically coerced into adopting hearing norms. So audism and oralism have big implications for the ways that we can understand deafness and music put together. Within the deaf community, music can sit uncomfortably alongside tenets of deaf epistemology. Inasmuch as music is deemed a hearing pursuit, its presence can be seen as threatening and colonizing, a technology of hearing power that facilitates deaf people's assimilation into the dominant culture. For this reason, some reject it outright, while others, particularly deaf musicians, demand access and involvement in this arena, arguing for the validity of their alternative sensory engagements. So I turn my gaze to the nexus of music and deafness because it represents a collision of worlds and ideologies, but more so because it sits precisely at the hearing line, which is the invisible boundary between the deaf and the hearing. Perhaps more acutely than in any other context, the co-presence of deafness and music produces a range of questions relating to what deaf people can do, and moreover, what music fundamentally is. Foucault uses the concept of dividing practices to refer to processes of objectification in which the subject is either divided inside himself or from others. And I'm arguing in this paper that music functions as a dividing practice, one that sits at that hearing line and is used by groups on both sides in order to delineate identities and communities. So by attending to and representing deaf voices, I'm attempting to remedy audiocentric notions of listening. And to that end today, I'll be mapping some of the spaces where deafness and music meet. And then I'll be going on to talk about a small scale ethnographic study I undertook with students in Sydney and then professional deaf musicians in the UK. And I'll be talking about what they have to say about the role of music in their lives. And all of these kind of findings speak to the various visual, embodied and kinesthetic ways that deaf people access music. Now, there's a popular saying in the deaf community, deaf can do anything except hear. My grandmother says this to me often. But if deaf people cannot hear, can they participate in or understand music? And this is a question answered best by the presence of deaf and hard of hearing musicians. Deaf people do, in fact, have a long history with music. The most commonly cited example is Beethoven's deafness during the latter part of his career, where he was reported to have actually cut the legs off his piano so he could immerse himself in the vibrations as he composed and played. But more modern examples of deaf musicianship can be seen in the work of Evelyn Glennie, and she's up there on the screen. She's a classically trained pitch percussionist who began to lose her hearing when she was 8, and she was profoundly deaf by the age of 12. She studied at the Royal College of Music in London, and her career has spanned decades. She's earned an OBE, later a DBE, and 15 honorary doctorates from universities in the UK. Her deafness, she explains, led her to understand and practice listening in a new way. In her TED talk, How to Truly Listen, Glennie claims that her job is all about listening, and my aim really is to teach the world to listen. She goes on to articulate the ways that music can be perceived by opening up the entire body rather than just through the ears. And she describes the ways that she learned about pitch with her teacher, and she would put her hands on the walls of the music room and feel the vibrations in order to kind of understand the pitches. And she reports being able to feel the vibrations of notes created by her instruments in various parts of her body. So the lower notes she actually feels in her legs and feet, and the higher notes in various places on her face, chest, and neck. And this haptic method allows her to access music far more broadly than simply relying on the ear. Though Glennie is arguably the most famous contemporary deaf musician, there's also other significant figures and interests in this space. Signed song is one of those incredibly popular things, and more sign language interpreters are appearing on stage next to performers to render music more accessible to deaf audiences. Many schools for the deaf also run music programs and signing choirs for their pupils. And in popular music, deaf rap and hip hop are burgeoning, with both professional and amateur performers contributing to the music landscape. So in 2009, for example, Finnish rap artist Signmark became the first deaf person to get a recording deal with an international music label. And deaf American hip hop artist Sean Forbes also became popular and got a 2-record contract with Eminem's producer. And both of these artists perform using their native sign languages and thus challenge a lot of audiocentric ideas about music and deafness in the performing arts. There's also many lesser known deaf artists and educators all over the world, but one concentration that I'm particularly interested in is Music and the Deaf and the network that they've set up in the UK. So they're actually a charitable organisation, and they're the only kind of their, only one of their kind in the world. And they were established by the deaf pianist and organist Paul Whitaker in 1988. And their mission is to provide access, education, and opportunities in music for deaf children, young people, and adults. And that's taken from their website. They also have this incredible Forte ensemble comprised of all deaf sign language using musicians, and they perform all across the country. The rich, diverse musical interests and endeavours of deaf people are, however, often overlooked by the hearing world and hotly debated in the deaf. In both an abstract and concrete sense, the hearing line is implicated in discussions of deafness and music, and it's monitored and policed by gatekeepers on either side. Critics like Rebecca Atkinson suggest music irrelevance to deaf culture, arguing that hearing people's fascination with the relationship between music and deafness just does not resonate with most deaf people. And she laments the tired representations that are preoccupied with deaf people living silent lives or their lack of music and birdsong. The role of music in deaf lives is so contentious and polarizing that in 2017, a deaf singer named Mandy Harvey made it through to the finals of America's Got Talent. She was actually sent death threats from within the deaf community. And the backlash against Harvey condemned her for promoting a hearing activity, and that was tantamount to supporting oralism. And such is the predicament, perhaps, of the deaf musician, that they have a foot on either side of the hearing line, often having to prove their worth to the hearing world and their loyalty to the deaf community. There are a significant number of voices advocating for music's place within deaf culture, often through the lens and vernacular of disability or deaf activism. In testimonies of deaf musicians, as well as in scholarly literature, references to access, inclusivity, and even music as a human right are quite common. DJ Troy Lee makes a plea for the acknowledgement of deaf people's involvement with music, and he states, "We need to reverse the myth that deaf people can't enjoy music. I want to show the world that deaf people can play music just as well as our hearing peers." And deaf scholar Summer Loeffler affirms, deafness does not get in the way of music appreciation and production, but rather provides an alternative form of listening to music. Despite this, deaf musicians and fans continue to be subjected to stigma and prejudice. Paul Whitaker, who I mentioned earlier, was rejected from 12 universities before he was accepted at Oxford, and several others acknowledge barriers regarding their entrance and acceptance within the world of music. And given this, it's unsurprising that deaf musicians employ rights-based language to defend their participation in this space. As Mitchell and Snyder argue, disability, and indeed deafness, is the master trope of human disqualification. And given that deaf people are largely excluded from musical spaces, these utterances can be understood as powerful rhetorical moves against the status quo. And depending on how we perceive these musicians, we might see either a conservative or a radical politics at play. So there's very few sort of cultural analyses of these intersections, and very few that capture the voices of deaf musicians or deaf people themselves. Most of the existing research exists in the fields of audiology and focuses on listening through cochlear implants and hearing aids. And then there's quite a bit in music education and also in music therapy. But a lot of this is sort of reflective of medicalized discourses and rehabilitative discourses. And for that reason, I'm not particularly interested in that. And I'm more focused on the emerging discourses around deafness and deaf gain. So this discourse emerges in the field of deaf studies, where scholars are providing counter-hegemonic and deconstructive analyses of music and deafness, which hinge on this expression of deaf gain, which is basically a concept that shows deafness as a benefit rather than a deficit. Marla's research into signed song builds upon Garland-Thompson's idea of disability as a resource and argues for the value of conserving the deaf experience of music. She states, "Deafness is not a deficit for music experience. Rather, it is a source of musical ability." And she reminds us that the deaf tradition of signed song extends back to at least the early 20th century, and that deaf people create sign language music, grounding that music in the characteristics of sign language. In a similar vein, DiBernardo Jones, who has a deaf, music-loving son, argues for a way of making and listening to music that is specifically deaf. She writes about the need to hear deafly, that is, to contemplate deaf responses and perceptions of music. Hearing deafly, she explains, involves a consideration of deaf musical culture and of the linguistic differences and histories that are present in the performances and the reception of deaf music. And in packing this elusive deaf music, she determines that deaf musicians' engagement with music is multisensory, lying somewhere between the ears, the eyes, and the body. And noting the inherent autism of most understandings of music, she explains, hearing people tend to think of the actuation of a thin membrane in the side of the head as a necessary precondition for what one can experience as music. But the membrane is incidental. In a deaf musical experience, the whole body becomes the membrane. So I'm going to summarize now very briefly some of the key findings of a small ethnographic study I undertook with students at a school for the deaf in Sydney. And I spent a year approximately in the company of these students observing their musical classes, and I conducted a focus group with the students where I asked them for their personal reflections about the place of music in their lives. And I was also observing their signing choir practices and things like that. So it was a bilingual school that had a very strong signing culture and a significant role in the local deaf community. All students in attendance were severely or profoundly deaf, with some using amplification and cochlear implants. And at this juncture, I just want to point out that music education is actually compulsory for all students in New South Wales. And though that the school did make some modifications, particularly with the kind of oral tests and things like that, they're basically following the standard curriculum. There were 7 students in the focus group, and the school itself is very small. There's only 30 odd in the total school. So the sample size is very modest and can't be said to be representative of deaf experience, but they do sort of provide some interesting insights into Australian deaf children's perceptions of music and the role of it within their world. So when I asked them a series of questions about the use of music in their home and school lives, everyone reported the presence of music in both home and school. Many described listening or watching music on devices like their laptops, tablets, and hi-fi systems. And one student says that she always plays music really loudly at home. Others nodded their head in agreement. Another volunteered that they turn the volume up to 100 and blast it across the house when no one's home. And many students laughed in recognition of this, and a lot of them sort of provided signed impressions of the vibrations created by the sound, so like a sort of thing. But during my observation of these classes, volume was often a bone of contention and an ongoing joke between the hearing teacher and the deaf kids. So it was always incredibly cacophonous in the room with multiple instruments being played at once. And on one occasion, the teacher, well, multiple, but one specifically, she pleaded with the students to turn things down and said she was getting a headache. And one student laughed and said, "Oh yeah, we like it loud." But on the topic of other musical activities enjoyed, students referenced singing in the shower, dancing and feeling connected to the beat, and playing musical games like Guitar Hero or karaoke. Others referenced playing instruments for fun. One played piano, 2 regularly play the flute, and another practiced the drums. All students had experimented with musical instruments at school, and some were members of the signing choir and cited the signing choir as kind of the origin of their interest in music. I often caught students with iPads watching music film clips covertly when they were in class doing, the wrong thing. But they often were watching these video clips that had subtitles that flashed up with different colors as the lyrics were being sung. And a lot of the students just really loved to do this whenever they had the opportunity. And I also witnessed a lot of students sort of pressing their ears to devices or kind of pressing instruments close to their body in order to feel the sensations. But when I asked them what music meant to them, many elaborated on personal experiences that they'd had with playing or listening or dancing to music. One student described their relationship to their drum kit, stating, "When I was little, I fell in love with drumming and was pretty good at it. When I play drums, I feel really in control. I can make the sounds and it feels awesome. It makes me feel like I belong to something." Another referenced their love of dancing, particularly to music with Chinese percussion because of the strong vibrations that they create. And one student spoke about music, emotion, and empathy, saying, "Sometimes I feel connected to the music. For example, Hello by Adele, I can really feel what she's feeling. When someone is going through something, even though I'm not experiencing the same, I feel and cry along with them." When I asked them how they experience music, one student reported a visual connection with stimuli. "I experience it with my eyes," they said. "Like when I'm watching a music video, it's like I can feel it with my eyes." Others reported the sensation of felt vibrations in parts of their body. Some said that they felt music in their hands and feet, and one student described the feeling of music rushing right from his feet up into his brain. And these findings link to the research of Robert Fulford, who identifies different types of deaf musicians. So some can be understood as auditory attending, where they use residual hearing or whatever they can get through amplification, so that kind of pressing of the ear to the device, while others consider vibration and vibrotactile feedback as essential parts of the sensory experience. And many of these musicians actually take off their cochlear implant or their hearing aid as they're playing. And some are visually oriented and so use visual cues and strategies in their music making. And some, of course, use a combination. When I asked if music should be taught in deaf schools, 6 of the 7 students said yes. The same response was given when I asked if they enjoyed music. Only one student there said no. And at that point, this huge, very impassioned argument broke out within students, which is represented on the screen here. So one student said, "Hey, some people like music like I do." And then one said, "You should go to a mental hospital." "Yeah, an asylum. If you don't have music, you don't have feeling. Life would be lonely. Music brings enjoyment and excitement. Without it, you'd end up cold-hearted, not feeling sadness, love, humor. No music is like a life in black and white. Music is the color in the rainbow, so on and so forth. So I certainly didn't anticipate this kind of polarized discussion, but it was interesting to see. So this is Forte, who are part of Music and the Deaf and their little network. And I interviewed all of these musicians and spent time with them over the course of 2 weeks, following them around. And this is them playing at the House of Lords. Inclusion was a really big concern for these musicians, and Danny Lane, the pianist, spoke at length of issues relating to access. And he said, deaf people shouldn't be excluded because of their hearing loss, and we know that music makes a real difference to their lives. And he expressed frustration with the difficulty that he and others find in attempting to break through into musical spaces. Interestingly, he identified this lack of access as part of a broader social inequality. He explained, I think it's part of a bigger picture. Deaf people aren't accessing jobs. There are a lot of barriers that they're facing. It's not just music they may not be accessing. In discussing Forte, he stressed the importance of raising awareness about issues relating to deaf musicians and their place on the periphery of musical spaces. And he said that he hoped audiences would be challenged upon viewing their performances and think, actually, deaf people can play and enjoy music. He says, I think with Forte, it raises expectations about what deaf people can achieve as musicians. All of the musicians in the Forte group are music graduates, and some of them have graduated from conservatoires. And this language of activism is also echoed in responses given by Ruth, who's the flautist. She says, music is not about hearing any more than language is. When I asked Ruth about her experiences, she mentioned difficulties on either side of the hearing line. From hearing people, she said that disbelief and that question of, yeah, but sort of how do you play, was a persistent gripe. And on the other side, from deaf people, suspicion and criticism were also identified as boundaries. And she recollected one experience where she went to a deaf club in the UK and someone was quite combative and said, are you trying to be hearing? But her political ethos is very much evident in her claim that there is a place for music and deaf children. They deserve and have a right to it. And she also echoed Danny's sentiment about needing to publicise the need to talk about deaf musicianship. And she identified Facebook and Instagram posts as a ways of getting these stories out there. Other useful reflections pivoted on the concept of music as a language, and this idea is not necessarily new, but it becomes interesting when considered in the context of the deaf community. As Loeffler tells us, some scholars have speculated that the deaf are the only cultural group without their own music, but hopefully, as we've seen today, that's not the case. One music teacher that I interviewed highlighted the deaf-centric history of music in the deaf community and made an important distinction about deaf music and the ways it could disrupt audiocentric understandings. She explains, the very first music programs for the deaf started at the Rochester School for the Deaf, which was a signing school for the deaf in the US. There, they had a marching band, and it's brilliant because if you're blowing a clarinet, you're not speaking and you're not signing. Music is your language. And of course, while it might be romantic to assume that music is free of all constraints or historical association with hearing culture, there is something compelling about the idea of music as a neutral space, or at least a space where it doesn't, where vocalized speech is not enforced. So to very quickly sum up, I just want to finish today with some reflections upon an arts project that's been developed by Ruth Montgomery. And this initiative brings together a bunch of different artists, musicians from across the UK, including Dame Evelyn Glennie, who I mentioned earlier. And it's designed to provide cross-disciplinary opportunities for deaf artists. And I just want to share what they've put up on their Facebook page, an explanation, I guess, of their political orientation and their multisensory focus. So they write, the name audio visibility is derived from 3 separate words, audio, sound, music, vision, and ability. Generally, society perceives deaf people as having an audio disability. However, audio visibility highlights that deaf people are able to listen to, appreciate, and interpret music, particularly through its inherently visual nature. And such a stance, I think, is decidedly political, proactive, and counter-hegemonic. And of course, we could see the presence of music in deaf spaces as deeply problematic, as a kind of assimilation in the same vein as oralism. But equally, we might think of music being and re-territorialized in some instances, reclaimed from the stranglehold or language of the colonizers. And when we look at these examples of deaf musicians and deaf students, their political sentiment seems to suggest a very deaf-centric approach to music, one that's informed by deaf gain rather than ideas of deficit and hearing loss. So in sum, by listening to or paying attention to these stories, perhaps we might be able to undo some of these oldest notions of music and expand our definition beyond the limits of the auditory. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jess. Very much appreciated. Great. And we're going to take questions at the end. So I'm going to move on to Andrew, who is giving a paper titled Himalaya Online, Understanding Contemporary Epic Performance, Trance and Archival Practice amongst Globalizing Communities in India, Nepal and Australia. Andrew.
Thank you, Denis, and thank you to the two speakers before. This paper may be in a different vein, but I was fascinated with what was spoken there, and I'm not sure I'll get a chance to have questions myself. At the same time, my paper is probably going to be quite short, so there might be extra time for questions, not just to me, but to the two previous speakers before that. Nearly there. I'm just, there we go. Could everybody see that properly there? Yep, good. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin by dazzling you with some statistics and graphs. Now, as some of you will hear the cynicism in my voice there, yes, I'm tapping into the scientific logics of particular ways of portraying things, but there is a reason, because I want to then tie this back to an ARC project grant application that I've put forward with a colleague at UNSW and bring some of those things back. I'll start with this. It's a detailed pivot table, and I haven't a clue what a pivot table is, but I'll tell you that it's a pivot table of monthly international student enrollment data given to us by Austrade. Now you can see up the top, China, of course, is streaking ahead with many hundreds of thousands of students. India is coming in a close second, below that Vietnam. And these ordering of the different countries has been organized according to the year. So this is the 2013 data and ordering the League of International Student Tables, and it's not surprising at all. If we take the 2015 data, nothing much has really changed. You can still see China is up the top. India is coming in second, catching up a bit. But what happens if we take the 2017 data? And I've put a question mark there to make you think a little bit. Who do you think would come in at the third of those other countries? Well, in fact, Nepal comes in as number 3, and that's probably very surprising to most of us, because we wouldn't have understood that to be the case, Nepal being much further down the table. And if you go all the way to the 2019 data, well, Nepal is still there, and you can see next to, just above Brazil, there's actually quite a gap between that. Now, this is all league tables and Austrade data, and who really cares how many students are coming from where. This article actually is where I started, an intriguing commentary by Michael Koziol, who in 2019 was suggesting, well, why is Australia such a popular destination for Nepalese students? And most people would have found this surprising. And then his comment at the bottom of this slide, the trend has alarmed higher education experts who warn it is unlikely that students can genuinely afford to study in Australia and are likely involved in exploitative work to pay for their tuition. well, what does this have to do with music, mobile phones, or my own research? And that's where I'll digress a little bit, starting with this map, just to make sure we're in one location, because what I want to talk about is identity associated with geography and national identities and people migrating from this part of the world. Here is a map of the Himalayan area, and you can see, of course, all of the different countries involved. So there is Nepal in the middle there, and Tibet over top on the plateau above the rest of the nations in that sense. India, of course, has various Himalayan communities split across different national borders up to the west and to the east. And then Bhutan in the middle. Well, not really in the middle, but you have all of this different. So regionalism, as I see it in this area, is of course a matter of geography, but it's also a matter of national claims on the region and national ideas. More importantly, related to religion, language, histories, and imagined communities. And I really should have added music to my list there, because what I want to talk about are the cosmologies associated with epic performance, which of course is a musical performance. And these epic performances that are regularly placed online on the internet and accessed by migrant communities around the world, including those in Australia. So I need to talk a little bit about cosmologies before I return to saying, well, how does this all integrate with music, mobile phones, and the people I'm talking about? Here's a picture of Mount Kailash, which is a holy mountain in Tibet, and it's holy to Hindus as well as Buddhists and to those practicing Bon religion amongst the Tibetan people. In Nepal, of course, you have drummers like you do in other areas of the Himalayas, including these from before. So a lot of my research has looked at the way drums and drumming has been portrayed cosmologically associated with ideas of Hindu thought and the origins of the world. The world is heard to be created through sound, and it is Shiv, the great deity of the Hindu pantheon, who dances and plays his drum and thereby creates the world. So creation and the universe are ultimately something that is derived from drumming and sound. Now, this picture online is where I want to go back to talking about migrants and Nepalese migrants in Australia as well as elsewhere. It's actually, I'll read the bottom of the slide just here. It's Pandav Lila Gram Pathali Ukhimat Chopata Marg, which means it's the Pandav Lila ritual being portrayed in this place called Ukhimat. And the video is from YouTube, and you'll look, of course, all of the beginning part of the video, these two people have their own mobile phones, of course. They're looking at them there. The two girls on this side, well, one of them has a mobile phone and checking it out. Not only that, the baby up the top also has a mobile phone. In other words, smartphones are easily accessible in the Himalayas amongst these people to record ritual moments that are then placed on YouTube and other sharing sites for whatever benefit that creates in a dispersed community around the world. And I don't know what that benefit is, and I'm curious to find out. So I'm going to go to this particular YouTube video and play just a snatch of it and show you what that kind of ritual that you were just looking at the picture of might look like. in that particular video, what's going on is the characters who are all dressed up are enacting the roles of the different characters from the Mahabharata. And these kinds of rituals are enacted every year in November and December in villages in a particular area of the Himalayas that I'm familiar with. The story of the Mahabharata is one in which these characters are said to have been exiled to the Himalayas. They were sent there after they had lost a bet with their rivals. And for 13 years, they wandered in the Himalayas. And so those stories of the characters from the Mahabharata are reenacted by people in this region, not only as the great epic from Hinduism, but also as a connection to perceived histories in the region. So epic performance, that is, performance of lengthy tales of this kind, are deeply embedded within this part of the Himalayas, and I would argue, in fact, are an important part of other rituals within the Himalayas as well. Now, just going on to these, the usual YouTube thing on the right, you can see all of the other recommendations that come up for something when you're looking at this particular video. To me, what's amazing is the many thousands of videos of trance and trance rituals that are placed online with a clear pride involved in demonstrating these to be a culturally significant performance. And so the cultural significance is demonstrated through putting it online, being able to be recorded with mobile phones, and then sharing it with community members who may be anywhere in the world. I'll just play a couple of other ones. I think I have the time. This is and another one. And another one. Okay, I don't need to go on to show you any more of those, but all I can say is there are thousands of these videos of trance rituals from the Himalayas put up online for people to view as and when they wish. What to me is fascinating is that so many have actually been put up there, but also what the reasoning behind it is. And I would suggest it has a lot to do with identities associated with dispersed communities around the world. All of this comes back to just my thinking. I thought there could well be an ARC grant in this, but how do I nut all of that together? Well, here's how I did it. Firstly, since I examined ritual and performance in the Himalaya, clearly I'd have a better chance if I use my own expertise as the basis for the project itself. And then I joined with John Napier at UNSW, who by collaborating, we can in fact attach a little bit more gravitas to this. But more importantly, John has the experience in working with the diasporic community, the South Asian diasporic community in Australia. And so he would be able to help if we together are interviewing people from this particular community. The ARC requires you to demonstrate some kind of benefit. And so my benefits that I've put forward for this were through engaging with a rapidly expanding recent group of Australian migrants. This project will significantly contribute to an understanding for the condition and aspirations of people from this region studying in Australia. and summarizing some of the other benefits for the purposes here, the creation of a formal network of experts working on traditional arts of the Himalayas, digital archives, and what these kinds of recordings mean for archival practice is another aspect that I'm pushing within the overall project. And finally, to provide a more nuanced understanding of identity amongst different Himalayan collectivities in Australia. So what will we do? If the project goes forward, or even if it doesn't go forward, we're planning to interview migrant community members from the Himalaya who are now in Australia, and obviously part of this group who may well be at risk because of the sudden increase in population, to see whether their viewing habits are in any way related to the kinds of things I'm seeing regularly in the online environment, with rituals being recorded on mobile phones and presented for everybody to watch. So it's all about sacred geographies, and one of the things that these are the research questions that we're going to be looking at. What is the nature of Himalayan epic performance such that it lends itself to ritual entertainment in physical and virtual worlds? There's something spectacular about viewing and recording trance acts and then presenting them on the internet for others to see. And spectacular as a word is in fact used by certainly the people that I've spoken with very commonly as one descriptor for these kinds of things. People might want to see them because they are spectacular. It's nothing to be ashamed of, in other words. What is the physical nature of ritualized trance experience for the viewer in an online environment? I may not answer that question, but it's one that I think we need to ask if we're talking to people to find out if they actually watch these things from over here. What examples of such performances exist in collections amongst individuals, online and in formal networks? In what ways does the dislocation of geographic space through the use of mobile phones change attitudes toward epic characters, deities, and deification? And finally, in what ways do viewers react to and interpret internet trance differently to real life action? Oh, and one more, how might conventional archive practices be enhanced through internet sharing sites? Of course, Australia is a leading country in the use of digital archiving practices. And so I think there's a way that I'm going to be able to invite researchers from India to see those kind of best practices that are viewable here in Australia. And so finally, for the ARC, you have to put up some research aims. These are the aims of the project: to expand knowledge of digitally rendered epic performances as related to action and spiritual ordering and geographic identity in South Asian Himalayas; to advance theoretical knowledge of the online trance experience in ways that considers music's central role in triggering spiritual experiences, and that confirms shared geographic orders of imagined communities; to create a network of experts who investigate Himalayan and epic ritual digital dissemination, and to enhance understanding for Himalayan cultural practice in Australia amongst South Asian diasporic communities in the broader Australian society. And finally, to share experiences of best practice in archival storage, like I was just mentioning. So that's what this ARC project I've dreamed up entails. It was inspired through those kinds of statistics that did indeed surprise me. How suddenly has Nepalese migrant students suddenly increased in number compared to others? And secondly, through these thousands, and they are numerous, these thousands of examples of epic performance, that one can now find online, which only 20 years ago were almost unknown to the rest of the world. Well, who is listening to them and how does this impact on what's going on? And so that's pretty much all I wanted to say today, illustrating what this ARC project is that I've put a grant application in for, to demonstrate how it ties into mobile phones, smartphones, recordings, archives, and migrant communities here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And yeah, thanks. There's some, I can see some clapping there. So wonderful series of papers. So let's open up to questions. I think perhaps the best thing is just to open your mic and start talking. And if not, I've got some. But I always wait an uncomfortable length of time so that we're, let me know in the chat if you want to, but I've got a question for Jess, I think, and possibly Nicole. Or something that I found fascinating is this idea of, and I guess it's an Audist idea, that musicking, to use sort of Small's term for music as a process, as a verb, as a thing that we do, often starts, or the Audist notion starts as though music, musicians start from the perspective of hearing. And then because so many musicians, I played with one on Friday night, you know, have huge hearing problems, but still we play successfully together. And I know you used this expression, understand music, briefly, Jess, and I kind of thought, wow, what is it to understand music? And I'm wondering if you can speak to any insights that you can see that the community that you're working with, you know, lends us towards getting a better understanding of what it even is to understand music for all of us. I mean, surely it's different for everybody. Is it something that we understand, or is it something that's experienced for everybody anyway?
I think that's a really, really good question. And I think what I have found that there's as much variation in the deaf community as there is in the hearing community. So, you know, for example, if I listen to a piece of music, I'm very interested in melody and I'm very interested in lyrics. Whereas, you know, I have friends that are very interested in rhythm, beat, or the kind of, I don't know, other sort of things that they would pay attention to that I might not. And I think equally there are some deaf people that are not particularly interested or don't have a good understanding of music. They're sort of indifferent towards it. They think, oh, that's not really relevant to me. They might find it, they might feel excluded from that space or feel, I don't know, like it just doesn't apply. And I certainly have had experiences like, you know, I was speaking to one deaf man and he said, music, what for? I'm deaf, sort of thing. Is that as though that was self-explanatory? But I think that equally the understandings just vary even within the people, the deaf musicians that are playing and are really passionate about music. Like the different types of musicians, so the auditory attending, the sort of vibrotactile feedback being important for them, and also the visual attending. I guess Danny, the pianist, was talking about being very visually attending. So he looks at the score and his understanding is grounded in the score as a kind of a visual artifact. And so he says that when he plays, he's sort of visualizing the movement that's represented by the score. And he also sort of thinks about that as like his hand being connected to the score, which I thought was really interesting. And then Sean, who was the trumpeter from Forte, he talked about the ways that he really uses his body. So he plays without his hearing aids, he takes them off, and he takes his shoes off when he plays as well. So he likes to feel the vibration come up through his body. And he actually, at a cafe, took his hearing aids off in front of me and sang me a version of Happy Birthday with perfect pitch. So his understanding was very much grounded in, I guess, the body, understanding through the body. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's just so varied.
Thanks, Jess. I think there's so much in the work you're doing, and it's thanks so much for presenting. I was really yeah, kind of mind blown by some of the stuff. They're great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mary has got a question to the chat. I'll read it out anyway. It says, it's fascinating what you mentioned about self-tracking and personal responsibility for health. This is to Nicole. Do you think these assistive technologies shift the responsibility to be included in social settings mainly onto individuals?
I think most of the apps that I've seen that are kind of hearing and communication apps do tend to do that. I guess the ones that come out of the deaf ecosystem are maybe a bit different. So there are some apps that are like signed tours of museums or things like that, where I guess there's a kind of collectivist impulse, the shared cultural language, and also the shared endeavour of the museums and interpreters to present material. But I think most of the time the apps are more about, I guess, enhancing your own capacities to understand what's going on. You know what I mean? Maybe cleaning up video or cleaning up sound, amending music streaming to adapt to your own hearing or whatever. That is kind of the individual managing their own experience, which is pretty similar to other mHealth apps, I think. So I think that's what I found really interesting about Soundprint, was the fact that it was actually going like, the problem is not in the person, the problem is in the social space in which the person is trying to function. So yeah, I think probably there's other things doing similar, kind of redirecting attention to the space, to environmental matters, to collective concerns. But the dominant sort of critique of mHealth is about self-responsibility, self-tracking, self-management, and legitimately so. Like, I think that is a real problem. I don't know if that answers your question, Mary.
I wonder if that translates to digital surveillance, where that data is later collected. Do you have any information about that?
Oh, look, there's another app that I wrote about, Mimi Music, had a really interesting project, which was called the World Hearing Index. So they matched the hearing tests they'd done on people, mostly in the global north, but some in the global south as well, with noise levels, urban noise levels. And so they kind of said, oh, how old are your ears, depending which city you're in, and tried to sort of match urban noise pollution with the sort of averages of the extent to which people's hearing was older than their chronological age. And that was really interesting, because a lot of the critiques of biodata mining, extractive logics of removing biodata from people's bodies, is kind of, some people have their data taken and then it's given to someone else, like corporations or more privileged people. But in this case, the data was removed from people in particular places and was used for a kind of loosely altruistic purposes. So I think that's, again, it's part of the sales pitch for some of these technologies. Oh, look, it's for health, it's good. But at the same time, obviously there's money in them, their hills of biodata. And increasingly hearables are being seen as a really good source of biodata that can give you lots of information about bodies. So yeah, that's mostly exploitative, but I just think there's some interesting stuff in the edges of the exploitation. I don't know if that makes me, diminishes my political meanings, but yeah, the great questions.
Thanks.
Hi there. I have a question for Jess. So is there sort of a historical account of how the idea of the hearing line has changed? Because I imagine it'd be quite different, pre-hearing aid technology in terms of how it's sort of constructed. And I guess as a follow-up question, I'm sort of leading towards more contemporary ideas, like our colleague Sean Chandler, who identifies as deaf, capital D, E, A, and then capital F, sort of, in some respects, maybe bridging the gap between the hearing and the deaf world. And if you had any comment around that.
I think it's Christopher Krentz who talks about the hearing line, and he often talks about how the hearing line is represented in literature. So I'm borrowing that term from him. I don't know of any sort of historical accounts of how the hearing line is developed, but I think if you looked at deaf history itself, you would see sort of examples of the hearing line and the way that deaf people have been perceived through time as indicating how hearing and deaf people have coexisted in the world, I suppose. So that deaf history might be a good place to look. And yeah, I think technology radically alters that. And I think that cochlear implants being as controversial as they have been, and the use of hearing aid technology and stuff like that sort of speaks to that a little bit. But I think in terms of Sean Chandler and bridging a gap, I think that's an interesting point. Maybe they are sort of cultural intermediaries of a kind, sort of, like I said, straddling that line in some ways. I think they definitely see themselves as advocates. Certainly the music and the deaf musicians see themselves as cultural advocates for the deaf community, but they're also speaking to the deaf community and having to sort of, I guess, justify their interest in music and saying, no, I'm not just sort of taking on hearing culture. This isn't an internalization of hearing norms. This is something I identify with and take pleasure in for its own sake. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but yeah, I think they are in between in some ways. And I think it's really interesting the ways that their identities become sort of fluid or become both and rather than one or the other.
Andrew, oh, here we go. Yeah, we're going to wind up pretty soon so that we can have some coffee and sort of regenerate before we regenerate before we get into the next section. But Andrew, just very quickly, if it's possible, have you noticed any change to the rituals as a result of the media?
I'd probably find that difficult to answer because I would be making a generalization about the broader set of ritual activities. Probably they would have become more choreographed and more colorful in terms of costumes and that kind of thing, because people are definitely aware that these are going to be recorded and shown, so therefore let's make them even more visibly interesting than they might otherwise be. But aside from that, not a great deal of difference, no.
Okay, well, unless anybody's got something they can say, I can always sort of carry on in the chat, I suggest, but I really do feel that caffeine is probably required for some of us. And if we return at about sort of 4:05, somewhere like that, and then get going, a couple of minutes after that, how does that sound?
How about if shall I start at 4:10 precisely?
Even better.
Okay, so go get your caffeine and I'll crack the whip at 4:10.
Thanks, everyone.
I'll leave my screen on and others can choose to do what they wish.
A huge thanks to our interpreters as well. Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you, Kerry. See you later.
Thanks. Bye. Hello.
Hey, Nicole, I only managed to catch, I think, the tail end of your presentation, but I went back and just quickly read the abstract.
Does it make any sense?
Yeah, no, it sounds really interesting. You know, I've been consulting with Here For You. They mentor deaf and hard of hearing teens.
Mm.
And we've actually been running this kind of strange project where the teens themselves have been leading a project to develop a hearing awareness campaign.
Oh, fantastic.
So I'm consulting in terms of, you know, providing the research robustness with all the facts that they share, but also just providing that emotional support, because it's quite a strange idea in a way where you're mostly asking these congenitally deaf teenagers to go and present a campaign for typical hearing students to not get hearing loss, you know, so it's quite unusual.
It's so interesting because the sort of the deficit model that's
Yeah.
in that, and the idea, or you don't want to damage your hearing, be like me. Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah. So my biggest concern is, you know, you got to make sure that these teens, that, you know, their emotional well-being is going to be, you know, not affected by this. But
yeah,
it's actually been going quite well. But we ran a little Kahoot sort of quiz for the kids at the end, where we're really interested in whether or not the students are going to change their behaviors. And we asked them sort of four main questions, and it's like, well, are you going to take breaks in noisy environments? Are you going to use earplugs in noisy environments? And then there was another one, are you going to use apps to measure sound level?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that one actually has the least uptake. Like, and I was surprised by that. I thought like the students would be, you know, there'd be a big appeal to use, you know, a smartphone device and use tech. But it seems so far on the data we have, it's the low tech solutions, just moving away, having a break, or, you know, putting earplugs seem to be.
So is this typically hearing kids, or is this the
of typical hearing kids?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in the gendering of all this stuff as well. Like in previous papers I've written about this, about the kind of gendering of gear talk and the kind of risk assessment element there. You know what I mean? Like what's seen as uncool, and taking risks is cool, right? And not taking risks is uncool. But I suppose as you say, I guess putting earplugs in maybe is uncool as well. But you're saying it's
yeah, there was bigger uptake for that than there was for, you know, measuring the decibels with a smart device. So that was kind of interesting.
I break in there and bring everyone back to attention.
Sorry,
people who want to make themselves visually clear to everyone else, feel free to unmute the video and everything else as we begin the second part of the session. And I'm certainly looking forward to these three because all three have some kind of interest for me, particularly in the first one, which Alison is going to talk about, archival resonances, embodied sound libraries, and the corporeal lives of sonic effects. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Andrew. It's quite a mouthful. Doesn't seem like a proper academic title if it's not a mouthful, really. I'm just going to share my screen with everyone. Can everybody see that? Excellent, great. Okay, so I just wanted to basically start this presentation with a quote from Dave Whitehead. Dave is a really renowned sound designer and editor from New Zealand, and most of the Kiwi practitioners that I've interviewed worked under him and saw him as their mentor and a really kind of exemplary sound professional. And he was one of the key sound designers for all of Peter Jackson's major projects like Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, King Kong, and so on. And he's also considered a Pro Tools expert with a capital E. And Dave has nurtured a lot of new talent in the New Zealand sound industry. And so his quote is his advice to people wanting to get into the sound profession. And I think it's an appropriate demonstration of how practitioners view the importance of recording as a practice, as well as this idea of having an original voice, which is something that I will come back to later. But he's really emphasizing the importance of the sound library. So film sound studies, basically existing discussions on film sound, which is kind of where I'm situated, both in academic and in the industry, in that literature tended to focus on the aesthetics of film sound or sound as a narrative device, the audience experience of sound, and also the technologies that were used for the work or used to experience the work. And I was really interested in asking, what does it mean to work with sound professionally? How can we investigate film sound experience at the site of production? And especially what kinds of corporeal investments and embodied experiences does the practitioner have within or as a result of their work practices? Oh, actually, sorry, I'll just go back there actually. And sorry, I meant to actually also add here, just to contextualize, this particular investigation into sound libraries was part of my PhD, which took a larger investigation into the embodied experiences of sound practitioners, which also included Foley artists, location recordists, and sound editors and sound designers. And my participants were from all over the world. So Australia, New Zealand, the United States, the United Kingdom, and also South America. And I had sort of, yeah, I just was really interested in kind of investigating the embodied experience of the practitioner. So I coined this term, the cinesomatic, to kind of speak to the developing research into embodiment in film sound studies. And I also use it to describe, an embodied or sensory experience of film sound. And so I kind of wanted to ask, how do living bodies create or co-create and navigate the sonic materials for films? And so how do these often invisible and often inaudible bodies come to matter in the industrial and the cultural frameworks that produce film work?
I'm muted there. That doesn't matter to me, but why am I not hearing anything?
I can hear someone. So this research into sound libraries specifically grew out of observations and interviews that revealed a kind of intriguingly layered and interactive relationship between the professional and his or her sound library. And it became apparent in my research that the lack of library-focused discussions in film sound theory also kind of reflected the absence of phenomenological accounts of library database engagement more broadly. And I wanted to kind of deliberately disrupt those accounts of film sound practice that focus on technicity and the tools. And so my research kind of took a really interdisciplinary approach, but key to this approach are the philosophies of embodiment and those theorists who really took those philosophies and then applied them in a range of different disciplines. So many of them drew on the Merleau-Pontian phenomenology to explore film, sound, dance, music, and so on. But also, given this research focused on practitioners who compose a working industry, I also did consider the structures of labour practices as well as bodily practices. And I've just, got some kind of key theorists there. So postulating an embodied sound library. So in thinking about how sound practitioners relate to their sound libraries, it became apparent to me that not only is the library a loaded creative resource, and I put emphasis on the word loaded, it can be reconceptualized as a sensory archive. And this is because the sound files are oftentimes loaded with personal sensory impact for the practitioners that are working with them. So the sound library has been talked about in industry overviews and practitioner accounts of Hollywood sound practice. People such as Benjamin Wright, Vanessa Ament, who was once a working Foley artist, Liz Green. Their discussions don't directly analyse the sound library from an embodied perspective. So the literature frames the sound library as part of the functional toolkit of the sound professional, albeit a highly, highly valued part. So how the film sound practitioner corporally engages with sound libraries is, I found it was quite underanalyzed in film sound theory. And so looking at the sound library as a sensory archive also kind of deconstructs the notion of technicity and data as divorced from the bodies of users. So also the embodied practices of library engagement become important, as well as the content of the library itself. And so just to briefly outline the sound library and how it works in professional contexts, it is essentially a database of sound files, some purchased, some shared, and some custom made. And it's tied up with industry ideas around professionalism, around originality, and also creativity. So it's really a resource that's loaded with industrial meanings, but also with personal meanings. And that's what I found particularly intriguing. And a practitioner's or a company's library of sound effects is considered a key professional asset. And it also becomes tied into a practitioner's resume of previous work. And I have heard anecdotes that people have gotten certain jobs on major productions based off what their sound library was likely to contain. So with the sound library, we'll see perceptions of both aesthetic and professional value being mobilized. And Bourdieu had pointed out, questions around aesthetic taste and quality are socially constituted and acquired. And I think that insight is still significant for an industry and a role, as well as a tool that requires the professional to display artistic competence. So as I think the quote from Dave Whitehead kind of supports, originality is still a key marker of value. And as Pamela Bernard had argued, this is part of the legacy of the Romantic period in which inspiration and originality privilege the creator as an absolute individual. And you can see this echoed in writings about film sound and film sound libraries. So Benjamin Wright had noted that stock libraries have become much more than repositories for every kind of functional sound effect. As an occupational ideology, sound editors approach the use of sound effects with an ear towards their unique oral signature, a practice that is tied to the industry's preference for original field recordings. So, and again, yeah, Dave Whitehead, I was also told anecdotally that he would tell his proteges that every new movie deserves new sounds, and you wouldn't make a new movie cut together with bits of old movies. So I am just going to play a really, really short clip that was provided to me by an interviewee. Hopefully the sound translates across Zoom. I'm hoping for the best. And I really welcome you to think about any sensations or impressions or ideas or imagery that might come up for you as I play this. Hopefully it will translate.
I think we may not have any sound there, so.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Andrew. Oh, that's a shame.
Maybe.
Alison, if you just stop screen share, then start it again, just to ensure you check the bottom left corner box that says share sound.
Okay. That would help, wouldn't it? Okay. Sorry, give me 1 second. I will try and share that again. Okay. Did that translate? Sorry. Okay, now I can see you. I'm sorry, I couldn't see anyone before. Okay, so I'll just go back to sharing. Okay, so hopefully you got enough of a sound, clip of that. And I'll come back to talking about that clip in a second. But the building of the sound library, so creating a personal sound library means that some of the content of the library becomes deeply personal to the practitioner. And in my research, some post-production practitioners specifically detailed their relationships to certain sound files in their collection. And it was in particular those that they had created in some way. So the sound files in question were not only perceived in terms of sonic content, but were loaded with meanings and somatic memories. And I also found it really intriguing to think that that kind of relationship can become implicated in many productions as sounds are used and reused in many other projects. So what's the cinesomatic sound file and what do I mean? So the term sound file is a generic term that to me suggests a particular way of understanding and framing sound. And I think it speaks to the impact of that digital technologies have had on post-production sound practices within wider contexts of digital information management systems. And the framing and definition of sound file erases the bodily processes involved in its production. And I think portraying sound as a unit of data obscures the material reality of sound as it is heard and felt by living bodies. And so my approach argues that by moving past this kind of technical focus to inspect the sound file and the sound library through the lens of embodiment, we can see many pathways and patterns of corporeal connection. And so this includes the practitioners, obviously, who work with these sounds on a daily basis, but also obviously audiences who will then hear the sound files in a finished work, or indeed in many more finished works. And the framing of the sound library and the sound file as a corporeally infused resource kind of reveals the cinesomatic connections in film sound production. So I think it speaks, in other words, it speaks to many bodies in many different ways across many different contexts. So the sound library, when looked at this way, becomes much more than a kind of repository of data, but it becomes a living archive and a sensory palette. And it's no misnomer that these libraries are referred to as effects libraries. And it's no coincidence that theorists such as Hansen, Haggard, and Hoyer have identified this conceptual and practical crossover between FX and affects. And for scholars that are interested in the materiality of sound, I consider the alternative framing, which is to consider the sound file as kind of a container of lived experience. And this capture has the potential to provoke visceral responses in each listener upon hearing, and has the ability to be multiplied indefinitely. So in each new reincarnation, a sound can bring a new performative dynamic, and it can provoke new contextual meanings. So I argue that, yeah, film sound is really about experiencing the reincarnation of sonic effects. And I think in the sound library, this kind of plays out in a really interesting way. And the sound practitioner becomes the intermediary between technology and the phenomenological experience. And I kind of see them as the pilot body for a future audience. So what does this reveal about the relationship between the sound file and the practitioner? So the practitioner is already pre-positioned as a listener and a participant in an existing soundscape. And this actually becomes an influencing factor in shaping a practitioner's library. So Isabel Delmotte notes how sonic exposure transforms the human body into an archivist and a translator of sounds, as well as into an active participant in the preconception, existence, and organization of soundscapes. So film sound practitioners will make use of their surrounding soundscapes in recordings that make up part of their sound libraries. So Kiwi sound designer Tim Preble pointed out that, for instance, all the local sound designers in Wellington have what he calls epic wind libraries. So the embodied placement of the practitioner, as well as the recordings themselves, become geographically and historically located. And how a practitioner works with their library is, I find, also really intriguing. So the actual process of library searching and management draws upon a learned industry language for sound effects, as well as an internalized familiarity with the library's contents. So some practitioners develop and implement their own personalized language into the metadata of their library based on synesthetic or emotional associations. So this kind of assists them not only in efficiently locating sound effects, but also establishes this embodied relationship to the database that is completely based on subjective meanings and emotional and or corporeal effects. So for instance, American sound editor Frank Warner describes how he catalogues sounds in terms of kind of synesthetic associations. He says, I used a lot of red sounds, blue sounds, green sounds, which mean something only to me. Red to me was more of a hard, mean sound. Blue could be passive, green could be pastoral, very light or airy. It really depended on my mood. And so I argue that this embodied reality of the practitioner kind of becomes an imprint in the metadata of the file, and the library becomes this corporeal palette. And in his book on sound effects, Rick Viers offers a tip for beginners when building a sound library, which also points to a corporeal way of relating to content. So he says that you should name the sound what it is, not what it was. The brain can't see what was recorded. It can only interpret what it hears based on its memories. And this concept is your first step into the world of sound design. And as you deprogram your mind to forget what it sees with your eyes and reprogram it to see with your ears, you will find a whole new dimension to the sound effects recording process. So the sound library basically becomes shaped into a corporeal resource when the files are used in this way. So a synesthetically informed sound file, what I call a synesthetic sound file, is a sound that's been rendered rich with provocative power and association, and which can draw upon memories of the listener and the creator of that sound. So I've got a quote here from Matthew Lambourne that I've got sound files that only I've got, and even if they're just as boring as fridges that you might put into a domestic scene, that's my fridge, and I recorded that in 1997 while I was holidaying up north, and now it's singing in the movie and so on. It's just adding a little bit of your own world into it. I think it's really important. So I think this quote demonstrates that for those who work with sound professionally, the connection and the memory activated by listening to sound files reveals this embodied immersion in the conditions of a recording that are recalled by the process of listening and re-listening. And it also kind of ties into that idea of reincarnation, that it becomes reincarnated with lots of new projects. And so this is also where geographically specific sounds are woven into the library, and practitioners can experience a bleed through of personal associations and sensorial connections. And so, yeah, in this way, the sound library is a somatic archive that's individual to each practitioner. So spaces, objects, moments in time are captured in sound files, creating a somatically active and personally resonant sound library. And you could argue that the process of recording files is a narration of the sound practitioner's personal life and lived experience, and that these recordings then go on to form part of the sonic palette he or she uses to produce professional film work. And I've got a quote here from Tara Rogers as well, who kind of says something very similar, that many times she would go back and access tapes that she made 30 years ago, and the memory was so specific when she listened to that particular sound recording. And incidentally, Lambourne also told me a story about how he recorded his own house. He lives in Wellington, and he recorded his house during an earthquake and used the file in a documentary. And every time he had to review his work, he found it really disquieting because it was the sound of his house during an earthquake. And it was kind of weird. He found it quite an uncanny experience, and he said he'd never do that again. So what's interesting is that while new semantic and affective meanings are generated in new projects, the practitioner will retain the memory of the first experience with that sound. And so in creating recordings, I should say, for a specific gore library for a horror film, Lambourne notes how when he re-listened to those sounds, pleasant sensory memories were activated. So I'm not sure what images or sensations you might have got listening to the clip that I played you. But for Matthew Lambourne, whenever he works with that sound file, he really gets the smell of persimmon because he was mulching persimmon for a horror film. And it evokes the lovely, lovely smell of fruit for him. So just to conclude, I basically think that discussions of digital library use need to integrate embodied discussions to identify how the user becomes corporeally engaged with the contents of the library, especially when the data is materially affecting. The sound library needs to be reconceptualized as a sensory archive as sound files carry personal and specific memories, and sonic data becomes reconfigured with as a sensory unit. And existing discussions of sound libraries don't adequately depict how the sound library is part of the creative process of post-production sound. And it also opens the doors to reconsidering many types of corporeal engagements with databases. So not only, sound libraries, but other archives, databases, repositories. And there is also scope to think about how the practitioner relates to the non-created sound files and libraries, and rather than just the ones that they created. But yeah, that's going to stop that share. Thank you very much. Sorry if I rambled. I think it went a bit too long. Sorry.
No, that's fine. Thank you very much, Alison. And I'm sure people will want to ask or present their feelings about what they were thinking when they heard that sound example when we finally heard it. So yeah. Fascinating. I have a few questions, but I'll leave it to others when we get to the end. Thank you again, Alison. So moving on, our next presenter Pat, who I've worked with on a number of occasions, is going to tell us about sound fidelity, mobility, and wireless speakers. So Pat, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll just share my screen. Everyone can see that? Yeah, okay, great. So this paper examines the tensions between portability and fidelity. The technologies we use to listen to music are characterized by two things: portability and fidelity. Some are semi-fixed in spaces, some are fixed to mobile objects. Some are portable because of their small size and battery power, so we can take them with us when we go places. Some of these technologies can fill a space with sound, while others can fill our ears with sound and not the space around us. Some technologies store recorded music. Some of these are not easy to move around, but are considered by many to be high fidelity. Conversely, some storage technologies are small in size, but they are considered by some to be inferior in sound quality. One of the most popular technologies for listening to recorded music is wireless, such as Bluetooth speakers and wireless headphones. Wireless headphones allow one to listen to music without a cable between the headset and the sound device, most likely a smartphone. As with all headphones, be it wireless or not, they also allow music to be secret from the person to the person and not heard by others. Further, in many cases, they feature battery-powered noise-cancelling functions, which allow one to incur minimal amount of outside noise. Similarly, wireless speakers allow one to listen to music without a cable between the speaker and the sound device, again, most likely a smartphone. As with all speakers, wireless or not, they can fill a space with sound. However, unlike domestic hi-fi systems, Bluetooth speakers are compact and they can fit into a small bag and be taken to many of the places we might go. A battery powers the device, sometimes for many hours, without needing to be recharged. It's important to note that the wireless nature of these devices is not new. Wireless speakers and headphones can be contextualized within a long history of technologies that allow for portability. Boomboxes, for example, were a large leap forward in portability. They were popularized in the 1980s in America with brands such as Panasonic and Sone. They were portable as they were relatively small. They ran on batteries and had a handle for transportation, often represented in pop culture on someone's shoulder. A Walkman is also another example of this, but with a different approach to portability. The Walkman's portability allows users to take their music into public spaces and not have people hear it, something the boombox could not do. Contemporary wireless technologies offer distinct dimensions to notions of portability. Noise cancellation is a common element with headphones and further allow music to be portable against the backdrop of, say, a noisy urban soundscape. Rather than a disposable battery, USB charging allows devices to last longer without needing to be recharged. Also, the mediums used to play music, such as smartphones and internet access and streaming services, contain huge on-demand media libraries, providing further accessibility. To consider wireless technology and other technologies in terms of their portability and fidelity is to follow approaches taken by critical literature on the topic. Such literature often asks us to consider listening technologies in terms of, firstly, their fidelity, that is how accurately they reproduce sound, and secondly, their portability, that is how well they fit into our everyday lives. Fidelity is an ideology that is often framed as having a long historical tenure. As Perlman says, the valuing of accurate sound reproduction, fidelity to the original, as a supreme audio virtue dates back to the earliest days of the phonograph.
However, it is also largely confined to a particular cultural field than, say, the mainstream. Audiophiles are perhaps the best example of this. As Perlman writes, users may reject, resist, and reinterpret an artifact without questioning the scientific knowledge that has contributed to its production. The suggestion here is that some audiophiles pursue an approach to sound that is not always supported by science. Their ability to hear these things they claim they can is brought into question. Another small cultural field that values the accuracy of sound reproduction is those who work in large studios. Such musicians and recorders advocate for a high fidelity threshold at which listeners should hear their music. However, as this type of work is in decline, their ability to work in the future perhaps relies on a perceived importance of fidelity. As I've written previously, the continuation of sound fidelity is perhaps crucial to the legitimacy of large-scale production and its cultural working practices. These small cultural fields suggest that those who care about fidelity above all else in music is represented few and far between. Jonathan Stone perhaps best summarizes this position and writes, "The history of sound reproduction in the 20th century is not, as sales literature might suggest, a story of ever-increasing fidelity, and it may very well not be a history of audiences who really care about greater fidelity." If high fidelity represents only a few, then portability represents the mainstream. The development of technology suggests that portability has often won over fidelity. If we think about the person in 2021 who has a Bluetooth speaker, smartphone, and Spotify account, the level of portability they can experience far exceeds the technological conditions of just a few decades before. For example, a large section of a living space in 1966 might be allocated to storing vinyl records and the components of sound reproduction devices, such as an amplifier, speaker, and record players. But it should be noted that the latter listening context still exists in some form. So perhaps portability is now multi-layered and ubiquitous. Although written 25 years ago, Thrift provides a valuable account of portability that is not too dissimilar to present-day contexts. He writes, "Music has become entirely mobile. It can follow us around the house, from living room to kitchen to bathroom, on journeys as in-car entertainment." One might gather from this field of literature that the success of portability or high fidelity in a sound technology comes at the expense of the other. For example, efforts to achieve higher fidelity in a device tend to mean it becomes less portable. As a result, the more portability has become popular, the more fidelity is thus rendered as a practice that exists with only in the levels of extreme and practiced by a select few. But what happens if we complicate our understanding of fidelity to consider it not merely as subcultural, but also sought out in mainstream contexts, in everyday music consumption, often by the very same people who don't seek it out in other contexts? Put differently, what if one desires higher fidelity for a specific activity they are doing at one time and not another? And what happens if this in no way resembles the practices of audiophilia? To make such a purchase on how fidelity works in different ways, it's important to consider how people listen to music. Lee Marshall claims that we don't listen to music as a standalone activity anymore. He states listening is most often a complementary activity. People put it on the background while they're doing something else, such as exercising, doing housework, or socializing. Music technologies are clearly focused on things that we might do while listening to music. For example, streaming services organize their music around what people do with music through its mood functions, such as happy or feel good. If we think about how speakers and headphones are made for different things that people do while they listen to music, we can start to move away from the ideas that A, portability is the main objective of technological development, and B, fidelity is practiced only by a few purists. We can start to see that fidelity is more important during particular things that we might do. The way wireless technologies are marketed shed light on this approach. Speakers are almost always marketed as part of a social activity where music accompanies other sonic elements. The promotional images on the JBL website, a manufacturer of Bluetooth technology, shows two distinct scenes. The first is a camping event. The images show a woman sitting down on a large rock holding a camera. There is a fireplace set up. A woman is laughing, another woman is smiling and drinking. The JBL speaker is shown in the foreground of the shot. The second is of a pool area. The images show two women sitting by a pool, splashing water at each other and laughing. The JBL is also shown in the foreground. The mood in these images appears to be happy. And in these images, the role of music is perhaps limited to the background, with socializing as the emphasis. There is not the sense that the people shown are listening to music as a standalone activity. In fact, the music appears to be soft enough so they can still converse. This suggests that you can bring music into a range of places, such as put it by the pool where previous technology might get wet and damage it, or you can take it with you in your backpack when you go camping for a hike, something that you couldn't do with a boombox unless you were quite strong. Images on the Bose site show two distinct scenes. The first is a game of volleyball. The Bluetooth speaker is situated on a picnic rug on a beach, and people are seen playing volleyball. One person is about to hit the ball. The people are largely blurred, but the Bose is in focus. The second appears to be some form of dinner party. Like the volleyball image, the Bose is in the foreground, while the background is blurred. The background is a social gathering with drinks, fruit, and people dressed casually. As the people are blurred, the mood is perhaps less clear, but the act of playing volleyball and eating and drinking can represent a fun social gathering. Again, music is an accompaniment to the social occasion. Sorry. Images that depict headphones are quite different. Rather than a social event, they represent individuals moving through urban spaces. The images of the JBL Club One show people in urban spaces in non-social contexts. Crucially, the headphones appear to be blocking out the noise in those spaces. Image one shows a man making what appears to be a dance move with his hands to the music. It shows him in an urban space. There is a lake in the background, but we can also see what appears to be high-rise buildings. Image two shows a man getting out the back of a car, adjusting the controls of the headphones. We see a built-up area in the background, possibly the entry to a hotel. So beats also reproduce similar figures of solitary people in urban spaces. We can see two women there, both in built-up areas and largely kind of blocking out the urban noise that occurs there. I think this image is particularly interesting. We can see interesting. We can see a traffic jam, high-rise buildings, and a plane in the distance. All these things kind of connote noise, specifically of the urban kind. Against the backdrop of this, he is seen in clear sunlight with his eyes closed and smiling. He seems to have blocked out all these other things that are going on. These images depicting people using wireless technologies show that the role of technologies play in how music is no longer a standalone activity. But for me, it suggests more, that some technologies are better suited for socializing and some are better suited for when we are alone or want to be alone. They shed light on how companies imagine what we do when we're listening to music and how technologies fit into this. There are limitations to what these images can tell us about music consumption. They are promotional in their nature. They imagine what someone can do with music technology, but they are not necessarily a clear window into listening practice. In fact, it's well established within culture studies that the way that people use technologies can be highly individualized. Here, people use technologies in distinct ways to produce their own meanings. And I can recall such individualized uses of wireless technologies and speakers in my everyday life. I live in a bushland area and often see people using Bluetooth headphones while bushwalking, thus blocking out the chorus of bird sounds that other people might find pleasant. To the same end, it's reasonable to say that some people may not want to block out the sonic experience of noisy urban spaces. Similarly, Bluetooth speakers are not always used in social contexts. I often cook with dinner with one, and sometimes I use two and put it in stereo. And I put the sound up to where it forms a dominant role in that space, often to overpower the noise of the exhaust fan. I often see people using Bluetooth speakers in public spaces by themselves. I've seen them out the front of the building here at Macquarie, sort of a modern day version of the person with the boombox on their shoulder. However, two things are relevant, even against the individualized way that people use technology. Speakers fill a room with sound, and those in it are exposed to that sound too. Headphones do not fill a room with sound, or not to the same way. And those in it can only hear at best part of what is going on. Hence, we can perhaps say that headphones attempt to block out the world, whereas speakers often have to find a way within it. My point about wireless technologies and how music is no longer a standalone activity, listening to music at least, is that the importance of fidelity can change from context to context. But crucially, across these contexts, the ideologies of audiophiles are not seemingly present. By blocking out the world with headphones and noise cancelling, we are left with something approaching silence. This produces a space where one's entire audio field becomes comprised of music, even if we're doing other things like walking. Here, the frequency spectrum of highly valued elements of bass and treble, for example, must be represented in some detail. Conversely, Bluetooth speakers don't fill a room with sound and are often used to fit in with other sonic elements. They are often put at low volume to allow others to talk and to not completely overpower the space. We want, in this instance, a mix between the non-music world and the music world. The detail of the frequencies is perhaps not as important as it is within the headphones. It is for these reasons that I propose the term everyday fidelity to describe the importance of the accuracy of sound reproduction is mainly dependent on what we are actually doing. Sometimes it's important and sometimes it isn't. Portability plays a role here, but it's not the all-powerful thing that obscures efforts to maintain fidelity. It's a balance based on what people are doing with the music at the time. It's perhaps not so much about their personal ideological position on how important the accuracy of sound reproduction might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And you were spot on time. I mean, how precise, I mean, if there was a word, you know, you were, I've lost words, so you were accurate in the sense of time as well as fidelity. Thank you. I have a couple of questions, but let's hang on to those until the very end. And I'm sure some other people will probably have questions as well. And on to our last speaker for today, Denis, who is going to talk about music and machine listening, Spotify, Shazam, and search. So Denis?
Thanks, Andrew. Yep, good. So a couple of years ago, our family bought a car that has the ability to connect a phone and deliver instructions using Google's Android Auto. And that involved adjusting the settings on my phone, enabling permissions for location, searching messages and contacts, and so on. And for several months, I used this whenever I was driving, as it seemed quite convenient and was certainly, for me at the time at least, believe it or not, wasn't that long ago, novel. One evening at home, while checking through my Google account, I came across my search history and recall being quite astonished at just how much I had searched in the last few months, and also the level of detail, of course, that had been retained. And among these were recordings of voice searches that I could play back. And I remember feeling distinctly unsettling, an unsettled feeling to hear my voice and that of my then 8-year-old son, and background noise of the car as we made a request to listen to some Justin Bieber. I even remember where we were. Without thinking too much more about this, but being unsettled, I abandoned that type of searching and tightened up my privacy settings. But it was the recording as a result of machine listening that I found most unsettling. And I don't think I'm alone here. While it's now widely accepted that Facebook doesn't listen to our conversations in background to target ads, the idea that this was possible certainly gained considerable momentum in social media. You know, I heard someone talking about it recently. In fact, you know, it would be a major breach of privacy. So I'm going to proceed with the notion that Facebook doesn't listen. But it is this idea of machine listening that I'll focus on today. And I do so by drawing on work from a book manuscript I've recently completed titled Code Musicology, From Hardwired to Software. And so listening obviously involves some sort of attention, comprehension, awareness, cognition. And in the machine aspect of listening, the closest parallel to that are the operations underway through running code. In fact, the idea of listeners in code is quite widespread, in fact, and goes well beyond the idea of listening to sound. A block of code, it's a kind of structure, it's a kind of thing that does certain things. A block of code monitors something and responds to whatever conditions it has been programmed to kind of hear. And machine listening is a phrase that has been in use for computing since at least 1992 and probably longer. And so I guess what I'm after today, if I can be that bold, is to start, you know, I feel like I'm starting from a really naive idea of talking about listening in a scholarly sense. So any pointers towards kind of relevant literature that I suspect I've come completely ignorant of would be very much appreciated. So there are several tenets from code musicology that I've developed that I'm using to think about this. The first one is the idea of big music, and fundamental to a code musicology at where we are at this particular historical juncture is recognizing and exposing the politics and effects of complex hidden actions behind mundane quotidian musical activities. As Koutsoumakalis points out, we're in the age of big music. You know, imagine a common example of using Spotify with wireless headphones on, actually, our Bose ones, to follow on from Pat's paper, where we search for a song or we choose one from our library on Spotify while we're online. First of all, those search terms go to Spotify servers, probably, given that we're in Australia, in another country. From where I currently write, you know, beyond the personal data already held in association with my account, Spotify can collect my location, all sorts of online identifiers, all sorts of information about the types of devices, right down to kind of unique device IDs, network connection type, provider, blah, blah, browser, language, operating system, blah, just goes on and on and on. Device attributes on a Wi-Fi network, non-precise location, deliver stuff to deliver personalized content. And then finally, which was the one that surprised me most, was sort of motion generated or orientation generated mobile sensor data for the purposes of providing specific Spotify features. So that's just what they collect. And then there's a pretty extraordinary list of things that we then agree to let Spotify use our data for when we press that agree button without reading anything. Among them is marketing, promotion, advertising, compliance, legal observations, fulfilling contractual obligations with third parties. It's a very simple sentence, but I think there's probably a lot in that. Conducting business planning, reporting, forecasting, research, contests, surveys, and sweepstakes. When my request is processed, an encrypted stream of data is sent back. It's decrypted by the Spotify software on my device. And when I play it, more data is collected about the orientation of the phone, believe it or not. And then audio data gets sent to my headphones. And now if I have the Bose Connect app installed, which I do, and I haven't expressly chosen to block data being sent out, which I hadn't, but I have now, Bose gets data about my location, time, and song metadata. So after all that, I get the conversion, obviously, from digital to analog, and the familiar effects of changes in air pressure get to me as music. So there's a lot going on. It used to be a pretty sort of local act. And so one of the things, I'll come back to that. So a code musicology will inevitably need to attend to matters that are sort of dominant and important in this kind of code-centered environment. And I talk about the idea of music industries have really undergone something called sectorial transformation, which is, I'm trying to build on the idea that economists use, which is transsectorial innovation, which is where one sector kind of moves in on another and the phenomena relevant to that particular sector become more relevant to the sector that's being taken over, if that's how you like to think about it. In this case, the sort of IT software sector moving into music. I'm going to talk a little bit about how time is rendered digitally, because that's important to the analysis here, more so in the book, but a little bit here. So we need to attend to things that are important now in our code-centered industry for music, privacy, machine listening, and MIR, which stands for Music Information Retrieval. And so machine listening and MIR are related. You know, machines listen so that they can then retrieve information. So, you know, one of the most common types of listening, I want to sort of talk about several different types of listening now, or machine listening. A couple of years back, I did an interview with Glenn Dickens, who's an audio DSP, which is digital signal processing. He's a software engineer at Dolby. And he raised an interesting point about machine listening to me. He said, if a phone responds to a command such as hello Google, it is essentially monitoring all of the audio activity it can capture and is constantly checking to match what it hears with the commands it has been trained to act on. So, you know, obviously it's listening all of the time, but what kind of listening is that? So I've sort of dug into some patents as a result of this, which is new for me, to kind of work out what kind of listening that is for search. And what happens, and it's actually inspired by battery life on a phone, so that built into phones now is the capability to sort of listen for what they call a trigger listening. So they're listening for, you know, the S of Siri, hey Google, hey Siri, whatever it happens to be. They're just listening for a small part of what is enough as a trigger, and then that gets passed up to the software that we install, and you then get a longer period of machine listening while it listens to the search phrase or whatever it happens to be. So I'm calling this goldfish listening. It's a very low level. It's listening for 100 milliseconds. It's on all the time, but there's not really anything going on other than listening for an H or an S or a hey or a C or whatever it happens to be. Nothing to see here. Let's move on. Shazam is a service that many people have probably used. It's an app that you play it music, if you like. It listens to music that you're playing, and it matches what they call spectral peaks in a very, very clever way with a big database. In fact, what's clever about Shazam is how fast it searches a very big database, not how it really recognizes music. It's not particularly interesting as it happens. And then, it gives you back. But it's a particular kind of listening that is something that we direct it to do. Ratzler-Giva has got a really interesting piece on Shazam. With Shazam, we get a machine to listen, provide information, and if that track is in a particular database, we get that information back. If, like me, you listen to a lot of music from Papua New Guinea, Shazam isn't very useful to you. And at the same time, Shazam collects millions of little data points and sells them on to other parties for their own use. Interestingly, even to help people make decisions as to what kind of music to make, how to make music. And that kind of listening, again, not a lot to see here. This is the kind of listening I referred to in my first anecdote there. We induce it as listeners. It's selective. There's a finite listening time. Over that finite listening time, data is extracted that's somehow of use to us very, very directly. And we're talking about several seconds, kind of sentence length. These things make mistakes all the time and do listen and extract data as a sort of mistake process, but I don't want to go into that now. It might be an interesting thing to someone to explore. But not long ago, a few weeks, I think, or months, it was in the news that a patent had been granted to Spotify titled Identification of Taste Attributes from an Audio Signal. Generated a little bit of noise on the interwebs with people. Well, it describes a system where both speech content and background noise are listened to, metadata gathered, and music or other content delivered based on analysis of this audio. So the patent states that the analysis might include extraction of metadata about emotional state of a listener, a gender, age, accent, aspects of physical environment, number of people, and the listening suggestions could also include considerations of historical preferences of a listener or preferences of a friends of a user. And I should note here that this is a patent and it's not yet being used in any Spotify services, and Spotify have been very clear to point that out. But it's certainly possible, should we say. And so if the data to be collected as suggested in the patent is about listener context, this is a kind of different type of listening. And, I'm interested in what sort of data that gets collected and how it might connect to that it already collects. And there's an interesting study that's been done in this book, Spotify Teardown, which explores through actually sort of querying the Spotify servers of various bits of information. Spotify shut them down, but it's a great book and it covers a lot of territory. But there's this idea that we can get information from Spotify, and it's something I'm interested in exploring further, and it's something I've kind of had a little bit of a poke around at. And so Spotify has this thing called an application programming interface, or an API, and that allows developers, software developers, to query and extract selected information from Spotify. So I got kind of interested in this, and I deliberately chose something that I know well. It's a track that I co-wrote and played on and have families singing on. I'll play a little bit of that. People hearing that? And so I should shout out to my brother-in-law up there in Papua New Guinea at the moment, singing from the village. He co-wrote that with me and currently navigating a pretty nasty situation around COVID, I'm afraid. So that was a song we did for the late Seaman Dan, who's a Torres Strait Islander. So it's quite sort of local, really. But I was interested to sort of what information I get out of this if I query Spotify's back end. And so you send it this information. Won't go into the sort of horrible details of that, but this is the stuff that you get back. Danceability, energy, key, pretty straightforward, loudness, straightforward again, but stuff like speechiness and acousticness, instrumentalness, liveness, valence, tempo type IDU. So most of it I was kind of going, okay, I'll get my head around that, but what the hell is valence? And as it turns out, when you look into the documentation, valence is a measure from 0 to 1, because a lot of stuff in software development is from 0 to 1, describing the musical positiveness conveyed by a track. So tracks with a high valence sound more positive, while tracks with a low valence sound more negative. So all sorts of ethnomusicological alarm bells ring for me with that. Anyway, I got a valence of 0.517. I don't know what that means. Certainly not particularly danceable, is it? Oh yeah, it's not too bad, danceability, but anyway. There's a lot going on. There's all sorts of stuff you can query Spotify for, but they're very cagey. They do it very much within their own terms, obviously. And so, this Spotify listening as a different kind of listening is, it's continuous. I'm assuming that they're gonna, the idea is that it would be with a speaker like Alexa or a smart speaker that sits in your house, but whatever it is, the patent has been granted for continuous listening and data extraction and storage. And the way that would actually work, one assumes, is that some length of time appropriate for sort of that contextual data extraction, I guess, several seconds again, data's extracted, stuff is deleted. But it's that kind of ongoing, continuous, not user-induced background listening that I personally find worrying. Again, though, with the proviso, this is not actually happening. And of course, there's no chance it will, surely. But anyway, there's something odd, twisted, and ironic in this, that Spotify, an app with musical listening at the center of its appeal, of listening to music, appears to want to be able to use that as a Trojan horse to enable another kind of listening to our lives, largely non-musical, really. Ostensibly for the purposes of helping choose, more targeted, better music for us, but ultimately, really, that meets their main goals of modern transnational advertising commerce, and that's the collection of data to be sold on for advertising purposes. Get as much data as you possibly can from as many people as possible and pay as little for it along the way by whatever means. And I refer back to something Nicole said here about, as the new oil, data is the new oil, but it's like you need a bucket load of it. It's very, very cheap. You need an awful lot of this, I don't know, oxygen or something different. Oil is not good enough because it's not concentrated. They need a lot of data. And so, is it not enough to have the data about what we listen to and what friends we choose to connect to listen to? And I guess, yes, if you're a music-focused company, but no, if you're a data-focused advertising company. And Spotify's request to listen beyond a few seconds and listen to our lives in progress is, I think, a mark that clearly defines and reinforces this idea of sectorial transformation. This is something unique or dominant to software industries, not to sort of older notions of what music industry is here. Music here is the conduit the catalyst for a much broader advertising project? There's no such thing, but watch this space. There we go, Andrew, I'm done.
Well done. You too get top marks for
I get points.
Exactly to 20 minutes, so, which gives us a brilliant 15 minutes for questions.
Oh,
Or early caffeine, one of the two.
I was going to say we can talk for longer. We're not paying for interpreters now, so it's up to us.
Okay, well, so I will, if you can stop sharing your screen there, Dennis.
Yep, sorry, there's a quick,
Well,
the financials for Spotify. Anyway, we won't worry about that. Sorry, let me just, what have I done?
And I'll go up to view options on the top.
No, yeah, is it? Where am I? Where are my controls? Oh, here they are on the other screen. Sorry about that, everyone. Looking on the wrong screen.
I'm glad to see you get confused that way. I mean, I get confused all the time.
Oh, I'm confused a lot of the time, Andrew.
No, not that. Great. Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody, onto our screens like we're seeing here. I shall open it up to questions. Just do what Denis suggested before. Nicole has her hand up. So why don't you start, Nicole?
I specialise in the dumb first question, but my dumb first question, I have many thoughts on all of the questions, all of the fantastic presentations, but I want to ask an old person question, Alison, about the linkages between the sound libraries and sound professionals. And I was just kind of thinking, because I just turned 50, I'm like, oh, I'm superannuated now. But actually, if you have a sound library and that's attached to your, that's part of your kind of cultural capital that you take to a new project, does that sort of balance out any kind of ageism in the sound film industry? Like, because obviously the longer you've lived, right, the more recordings you have, presumably. How does that work? I mean, is there any kind of, oh yeah, he's got a bigger library, we'll have him, that kind of thing?
Yeah, look, thanks, Nicole. It's not at all the size of the library as much as your resume. So, and a lot of practitioners have complained about actually having too many, 10,000 dog barks, for instance, and it's like, they actually find them quite unwieldy at times. So, and I think it comes with the prestige of a certain production. And there are certain sound designers who, for instance, Dave Farmer kind of, developed so many signature sounds in his Lord of the Rings work. And so his library and his resources are considered incredibly high value. However, there are files that he will never reuse, so they become specific to the project as well. So they're files that he's worked on himself a fair bit. So they're not a raw sound file in that sense. Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm actually answering your question.
No, you totally are answering my question. Thank you so much. Really appreciated your talk. I do have other dumb questions if nobody else wants to jump in.
We'll move on to Ty. Ty, can you?
I'll do my best to articulate a question. My brain is mush after a whole day of teaching. But I had a kind of technical question for Denis. So you talked about the fact that there's the background listening, but it's only picking up or only focusing in on small sections of time, and then the rest is deleted or forgotten in some way. Could you talk us through how the code kind of decides what's deleted, what's removed, and whether there's any kind of residual trace of that ambient listening that it otherwise does?
Well, I mean, I would only be kind of talking to the possibilities, because obviously, you know, it's all proprietary. There's no kind of, and that sort of information isn't actually included in detail in the patent. But one assumes that once they've got a certain amount of extracted data in the form of text, it's textual stuff, and they're using either AI or just sort of traditional MIR techniques to get that data. Once they've got that, the audio is of no use to them anymore, and would be such a kind of huge amount that they would just, it would be pointless to save. And so I assume that they, in answer to your question, you know, they get a useful chunk of data and they would throw away the audio. And so the residual trace, that was the kind of key part of the question, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would just be that metadata.
Okay. That would be the case with, so your iPhone, when you say, hey Siri or something like that as well, right? That it would pick up at least that small section of audio that's of relevance.
Yeah.
But the rest of it, there's no real trace left behind. The code just says we don't need this anymore. So. Yeah,
and I guess what's interesting about that is that's what we kind of assume, but the power does very much lie in the code and the people that are writing that.
Right.
You know, tomorrow they could decide that's not the case and for a day collect it all. It would be extremely illegal and against all sorts of agreements, but it's interesting to me that that is possible, I guess. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Anyone else?
I've got a question, I guess. They were all fantastic papers. Alison, I wanted to ask the idea that, I can't remember who it was you mentioned, but you said that, you know, starting on a new project, it's best to start with a whole new suite of sounds. I guess that applies only to film, does it? I mean, if someone's to create a television show, are you creating a reusable sonic environment that represents that space by going back and reusing sounds you've recorded before? It's not really a question. I ask, what have you noticed different about TV sound designers and film sound designers?
Yeah, well, thanks, Alex. I actually didn't really get time to kind of go into the details of that, because that's the debate about using new sounds as opposed to library commercially sourced sounds is a whole can of worms in terms of how, you know, this idea around originality. And I think that the quote was from Dave Whitehead, and I think it was kind of more, I see it more as an operational ideology rather than the reality. And a lot of, I mean, I only really sort of focused on the film work, but a lot of the practitioners that I spoke to kind of move between both, and they sort of move between industries. Yeah, so I say film sound, but I don't mean to kind of bracket off, you know, television industry, animation, and also a lot of them are kind of now getting into VR sound design as well, and some of them do theme park sound design as well. So they kind of move across all these different industries. But yeah, what's really contentious is the use of commercial sound effects. And the key is, as long as it's not recognizable, as long as you change it in some way, you do something to sweeten it or something to make it not sound like a stock sound, then that's okay, because there's this tension around, oh, you know, I don't have time, and all of the practitioners do the craziest hours I've ever heard. And that's a whole nother issue. That was a whole nother chapter of my thesis. And yeah, so they have to use pre-packaged sound effects in some way. But yeah, there's still this, you know, kind of implicit expectation that they have to still make that sound file theirs and put a unique sort of signature on it in some way. And so many people I talked about got really, really irritated with advertising or movies where they hear a sound effect and they can tell me what library it came off from. The Hollywood Edge sound library, for instance, track 1, you know, they kind of were that familiar with it, and that was kind of really, really looked down on. But yeah, sorry, I've lost the thread of what your original question was.
That absolutely addresses it. I think that's a really interesting point, that even when a designer has to draw from a library, there is some sort of personalization that comes through about giving that sound their voice. I think you've answered my question. Very, very good.
Yeah, I mean, they don't necessarily achieve it. I mean, some of them, they just sometimes just have to, and they kind of acknowledge that they have to because of deadlines. The deadlines are relentless, particularly in film, or particularly with Peter Jackson, I should say. Yeah, that's the operating ideology, that, yeah, they've got to make it sound fresh. Yeah.
I might jump in here with a question for Pat, if that's all right with everyone. I'm curious about the mobility. You know, you mentioned that this binary is often set up between fidelity and mobility, but you were saying, well, it's not actually quite that simple. And so I understood what you were talking about there. I'm curious about the use of mobile devices as an aggressive, or not necessarily only aggressive, but an invasive tool within spaces and assertion of power and things like that. Do you see a particular connection with mobile devices, or do you see it as something that's yet a third element in this multi sort of picture that you're talking about, not just binary?
Yes, I guess I only referred to the use of, say, using a Bluetooth speaker in a public space very briefly, and to be honest, I haven't given it too much thought. I think, you know, it has that history going back to the boombox, and then maybe even before that with block parties, where, you know, sound is brought into public spaces. Yeah, I haven't considered it any more than that, but it is an interesting idea, the way that how the politics of, you know, public space work within that binary between mobility and fidelity.
Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up, Pat, just briefly? You probably know this Mac Haygood guy who's, you know, done this book Hush about, he calls Orphic media, you know, the idea of blocking out the world. So he's worked with the tinnitus, people who get tinnitus, and the use of technologies to kind of create this personalized space. He's got a kind of implicit critique of that, the idea that we should have controllable audio space around us, which I think is in some ways a bit ableist, to be honest. But yeah, stuff you're familiar with. I was just thinking about it in relation to that idea of the permeability of everyday sound and musical sound, which I love about your everyday fidelity.
Yeah, I haven't considered that, but it's kind of where I wanted to take the research from here. So yeah, I do want to look into, I guess, more theoretical perspectives on that. So yeah, thanks for that.
Jess.
I had a question sort of for Pat as well, following on from what Andrew was saying, and almost at the opposite end of that spectrum. And this is probably a stupid question, but I was thinking about the individualized use of headphones, and rather than thinking about aggression, like the aggression of the boombox or the portability of a device, thinking about headphones as a protective mechanism, and wondering about whether or not there's research into gendered dimensions of listening as a protective thing. So like a woman on a train, for example, putting headphones on in order to, as a bit of a don't talk to me sort of thing, or not using them at night when walking home or something because of, not wanting to block out the world. Is there any research in that area?
Not that I'm aware of, but I guess looking at the kind of promotional material, it's interesting how that wasn't really present. You had, I think there were a couple of instances, pretty much in all the instances, the person was kind of at peace and very happy. But I think you mentioned actually a really interesting idea. And you know, certainly when, you know, often when people walk through the train station, they'll just have headphones on, so you know, someone doesn't try and talk to them and sell them something, or I think that's kind of a thing. So yeah, I think that's another area where I could look into.
That'd be really rude. I've totally dominated the space, but there is one thing I'm thinking of on that, which is James Gilmore has written a piece which was about him using, you know, earbuds as like cheap hearing aids, but he found it didn't work very well because people wouldn't talk to him because he had earbuds in. So it's kind of like his intention was to amplify, but it was interpreted the other way. But I was thinking also about some of the iPhone ads for the wireless headphones. I used to use them in teaching, and the idea of the city as morphing to your will, to be able to run up a wall or to be able to do anything with the city. The idea of the freedom of the city is visualized so much in those ads, and with a completely, to me, a gender-free lens. You know what I mean? Like, yes, you'll be free in the city, which, you know, we just know isn't the case for many people, in particularly women, but others as well. So yeah, there's a kind of a fantasy of a deracialized, degendered city in which everybody's free to go everywhere and nobody's in danger anywhere in that PR.